Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand battlefield or a royal court, but to a quieter, dustier corner of history, one filled with quill pens scratching, wax melting, and the faint scent of ink. Imagine, if you will, the flickering gaslight in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, the only sound the rustle of heavy skirts and the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock. You're sitting at a polished mahogany desk, perhaps a bit stiff in your corsets or your starched collar, with a blank sheet of paper before you. The silence is profound, almost suffocating, broken only by the scratch of your pen. Tonight, we're delving into the peculiar, often baffling world of Victorian letter writing. You probably won't survive this journey without a newfound appreciation for instant messaging, that's for sure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before the penny black, before the great postal reforms, sending a letter in Victorian England was, to put it mildly, a bit of a chaotic gamble. You might think, oh, it's just a letter. How hard could it be? Well, prepare yourself, because the early Victorian postal network was less a well-oiled machine and more a collection of disparate, often maddening, practices that would make your modern, trackable, next-day delivery seem like a futuristic dream. Imagine you're living in, say, 1830. You've just finished a rather tedious letter to your Aunt Mildred in Bath. Now, what do you do with it? You couldn't just pop down to the corner and drop it into a bright red pillar box. Those hadn't been invented yet, not really. Instead, you'd likely take your carefully folded, unsealed missive to the nearest post office. And when I say post office, don't picture the clean, orderly places we know. Think more along the lines of a small, often cramped room in a larger building, perhaps a pub or a general store, where the postmaster juggled his various duties with the incoming and outgoing mail. It was, shall we say, a multitasking environment. Now, here's where it gets truly interesting, and frankly, a bit bewildering. Who paid for this letter? Not you, the sender, necessarily. In most cases, the recipient paid upon delivery. Yes, you heard that right. Your poor Aunt Mildred, when the postman finally trudged to her door, would be presented with your letter and expected to cough up the fee. And this fee wasn't some flat rate. Oh no, it was a complex calculation based on several factors. The distance the letter had traveled, and crucially, the number of sheets of paper enclosed. One sheet traveling a short distance might be a few pence, but a multi-page letter going across the country, that could be a significant sum, perhaps even a day's wages for a working-class family. You can imagine the incentive to keep your letters concise, can't you? And to write in tiny, cramped script, filling every available space, even turning the paper sideways to write cross-hatched lines over your original text, just to avoid an extra sheet. This was known as crossing, and it made letters a nightmarish puzzle to decipher, but it saved money. Historians still argue whether this practice was born purely of economy, or if there was also a touch of more bang for your buck, pride in cramming as much information as possible onto a single sheet. This recipient pays system led to some truly peculiar practices. For instance, imagine receiving a letter that you weren't expecting. or one from someone you absolutely despised. You could simply refuse to accept it, and thus refuse to pay. This, of course, meant the post office lost out, and they weren't too keen on that. But it also gave rise to a rather ingenious, if somewhat rude, form of communication: the refused letter code. Families or lovers might agree on a specific mark or symbol on the outside of an unsealed letter, a mere doodle, perhaps, like "I've arrived safely," and they could then refuse the letter without paying. It was a kind of silent, free text message of the 19th century, allowing just enough information to be conveyed without incurring the cost. Imagine the frustration for the postal worker, trudging along, only to have their delivery constantly refused because some cunning Victorians had figured out a loophole. It truly was the Wild West of communication. The post office itself was a patchwork. There were Royal Mail coaches galloping across the countryside, delivering letters and parcels. These were often targeted by highwaymen, making the journey for mailbags rather perilous. But beyond the main routes, smaller towns and villages often relied on local carriers, or even just anyone willing to transport a letter for a small fee. Reliability was, shall we say, variable. A letter might arrive in a few days, or a few weeks, or sometimes not at all. There was no real tracking system, no customer service hotline to call when your urgent missive went missing. You just waited and hoped, and perhaps occasionally sent a second, equally expensive letter, just to see if the first one had actually made it. It was a masterclass in patience, a virtue we've perhaps lost a little in our age of instant gratification. Consider also the sheer physicality of it all. Before machine-made envelopes were common, letters were often folded intricately, then sealed with wax, using a signet ring or a personalized stamp. This wasn't just for privacy. It was a mark of authenticity, a kind of pre-Victorian blockchain, if you will. This meant that anyone handling the letter could potentially read parts of your private correspondence if the folds weren't perfectly secure, or if the wax seal was tampered with. It added another layer of vulnerability to the postal system. The idea of a personal letter being handled by so many hands, with so many opportunities for delay or intrusion, would probably send shivers down your spine if you're used to encrypted messages and password-protected emails. The postal service itself was often viewed with a mixture of necessity and resentment. It was essential for commerce, for governance, and for maintaining connections between families separated by distance. Yet the cost was a significant barrier for many, especially the poor. It reinforced social hierarchies, as only those with disposable income could afford frequent correspondence. This inequality in communication access was a major point of contention and would eventually fuel the movements for postal reform. Think of it like the internet today. Imagine if only the wealthy could afford to send emails or browse the web. It would fundamentally change how society functions, wouldn't it? So, as you can see, before the big changes, the act of sending and receiving a letter was a far cry from the mundane task it became later in the Victorian era, let alone today. It was an expensive, often unreliable, and surprisingly complex endeavor, full of hidden rules, secret codes, and the constant threat of your Aunt Mildred refusing to pay for your overly long 2-sheet letter about the weather you truly had. To want to communicate, to put up with all of that, it makes you almost grateful for the simplicity of tapping out a quick message on your phone, doesn't it? Almost. Building on that rather bewildering system of pedon delivery, crossed letters, and refusal codes, imagine the collective sigh of relief, the veritable explosion of communication that occurred with the advent of the penny black. This wasn't just a new stamp. It was a revolution, a quiet, administrative coup that utterly transformed how people connected. You see, before 1840, the system was so cumbersome that it actively discouraged correspondence for most ordinary folk. But then, a chap named Rowland Hill, a visionary, if somewhat stubborn, reformer, stepped onto the scene, and everything changed. Hill, armed with meticulous calculations and an unshakable belief in universal, affordable communication, proposed a radical idea: a uniform rate for postage, paid by the sender, regardless of distance, and based solely on weight, not the number of sheets, and the cost. A single penny for a letter weighing less than half an ounce. This was a seismic shift. No longer would Aunt Mildred in Bath have to dread the postman's knock, wondering how much your latest missive would set her back. Now you, the sender, bore the cost, a predictable, minuscule sum. This prepayment system, combined with the low, flat rate, was the bedrock of the penny black's success. The genius of Hill's idea lay in its simplicity and accessibility. To prove postage had been paid, a small, adhesive label would be affixed to the letter. This little label, bearing the profile of the young Queen Victoria, was the world's first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black. Its introduction on May 6, 1840, was not just a postal event, it was a social phenomenon. Suddenly, the ability to communicate across distances was democratized. No longer was it a luxury primarily for the wealthy or for urgent business. Now, the humblest servant, the struggling artisan, could afford to send a letter home to a loved one or to seek opportunities further afield. Think about the psychological impact of this. Before, every letter was a potential financial burden on the recipient. Now, it was a small, prepaid gift. The act of sending a letter transformed from a complex transaction into a simple, everyday occurrence. You could imagine a domestic servant, earning perhaps a shilling or two a week, now able to spare a penny to send news to her family in the countryside. This seemingly small change had massive repercussions, leading to an exponential increase in the volume of mail. The postal service, once a somewhat sleepy operation, suddenly had to grapple with an avalanche of letters. And grapple they did. The infrastructure had to rapidly expand. More post offices were needed, more sorting staff, more letter carriers. It was a logistical challenge of epic proportions, but one that the Victorians, with their fondness for efficiency and order, slowly but surely tackled. They introduced post boxes, those iconic red pillars you still see today in various forms, making it even easier to dispatch your mail. No longer did you have to trudge to the post office. You could simply drop your letter into a convenient box on your street corner. This decentralized collection system further streamlined the process and brought the post office, metaphorically speaking, to your doorstep. The penny black wasn't just practical, it was also a design marvel. It depicted the young Queen Victoria head, based on a sketch by William Wyon, taken from her City of London medal. This particular profile was chosen for its timeless quality, and perhaps because it was difficult to forge. Forgery was a significant concern, of course, given the new systems reliance on these tiny slips of paper as proof. The stamp's design, however, lacked perforations initially. That's right, you had to cut them apart with scissors. Imagine the painstaking effort involved, especially if you were sending a bulk mailing. Historians still argue whether the lack of perforations was an oversight or a deliberate cost-saving measure in the initial rollout. Either way, it made for a rather charming, if slightly inconvenient, early philatelic experience. Perforations, a quirky tidbit for you, weren't widely introduced until 1854. After much experimentation with various methods of separating the stamps. So, for over a decade, Victorian letter writers were also amateur stamp cutters. The penny black and the postal reforms it heralded didn't just make communication cheaper and easier. It fundamentally changed the social fabric. It fostered stronger family ties across distances, enabled new forms of courtship and friendship, and facilitated the spread of ideas and information like never before. Newspapers, periodicals, and pamphlets could now be distributed more widely and cheaply, contributing to an explosion in literacy and public discourse. It was a virtuous cycle. Cheaper postage led to more letters, which led to more literacy, which in turn led to even more letters and a more informed populace. Consider the ripple effects. The reform stimulated innovation in related industries. Paper manufacturers saw a boom, as did ink makers and pen producers. The demand for envelopes, once a luxury, skyrocketed, leading to the mechanization of envelope production. It created new jobs within the postal service itself, from sorters and clerks to the ubiquitous postman who became familiar figures in every neighborhood. This wasn't just about mail, it was about economic stimulus and job creation, all sparked by a seemingly simple idea for a tiny adhesive label. The success of the penny black quickly inspired other nations to adopt similar systems. Within a few years, countries across the globe began issuing their own postage stamps and implementing uniform prepaid rates. It was a testament to the universality of the need for efficient communication and the brilliance of Hill's model. The penny black, therefore, wasn't just a British innovation. It was a global one, laying the groundwork for the modern postal systems we still largely rely on today. So, when you see a stamp, any stamp, or when you effortlessly drop a letter into a postbox, take a moment to appreciate the quiet revolution that started with that little black rectangle featuring Queen Victoria's young profile. It transformed a cumbersome, expensive, and often unfair system into a pillar of modern society. It literally put the power of connection into the hands of ordinary people, breaking down barriers of distance and cost. It was a profound democratizer, proving that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest, most unassuming innovations. And it all began with the humble, yet utterly world-changing penny black. It really makes you wonder what tiny, seemingly insignificant changes today will have such a monumental impact on tomorrow, doesn't it? Just imagine. With the penny black democratizing the very act of sending a letter, the floodgates opened. But simply sending a letter wasn't enough. One also had to know how to write one. And in Victorian society, this was far from a casual affair. The etiquette of letter writing was a labyrinthine set of unwritten rules, social expectations, and subtle codes that dictated everything from the type of paper you used to the precise phrasing of your salutation and closing. You couldn't just dash off a quick note like you might an email today. Every letter was, in a sense, a performance, a carefully crafted reflection of your social standing, your education, and your respect for the recipient. Imagine yourself armed, with your newly affordable penny black, sitting down to compose a letter. You wouldn't simply grab any old scrap paper. Oh no. The choice of stationery was paramount. For formal correspondence, say, an invitation to a dinner party or a letter of condolence, you would select heavy, cream-colored, perhaps even embossed paper. Lighter, less formal paper might be used for family letters, but even then, it needed to be of good quality. And morning stationery, a quirky tidbit for you, was a specific industry in itself, featuring black borders of varying widths depending on the stage of grief. The wider the border, the more recent and profound the loss. It was a visual cue, instantly signaling the emotional state of the sender before a single word was even read. Then came the addressing of the letter. This wasn't just about putting down a name and street. It involved titles, honorifics, and a precise understanding of social hierarchy. Addressing someone incorrectly could be a major faux pas. A simple Mr. Smith might be acceptable for a tradesman, but for an aristocrat, a series of titles and a more elaborate address would be required, and the handwriting itself, neat, legible script, was a sign of a good education and refined upbringing. Scrawled, hurried handwriting could be seen as disrespectful or a sign of slovenliness. For women, in particular, a beautiful hand was considered an accomplishment, often taught rigorously in finishing schools. The opening salutation was another minefield. For close family, my dearest mother or my darling sister was perfectly acceptable. But for a business associate or a casual acquaintance, something more formal, like dear sir or madam, was necessary. Addressing a social superior required even greater deference, perhaps your grace or my lord, and you certainly wouldn't jump straight into the point of your letter. Victorian correspondence often began with polite inquiries about the recipient's health or well-being, or perhaps a gentle reference to their last letter. It was a warm-up, a social lubricant before the main event. The body of the letter itself was expected to be well-structured, coherent, and grammatically correct. Spelling errors were a definite no-no. It was a chance to display your command, language, your wit, and your intelligence. Rambling, incoherent letters were frowned upon. The prose tended to be more formal and elaborate than our modern conversational style. You wouldn't find many contractions or slang. It was a more elevated form of discourse, even for personal letters. Think of it as writing a mini essay with every communication. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects was the art of the closing. This wasn't just a quick, sincerely, or best. The closing carried significant social weight, conveying the precise nature of your relationship with the recipient. For very formal letters, you might sign off with your obedient servant. Now, imagine using that today. It sounds almost comical to our ears, but it conveyed respect and deference. For slightly less formal, but still respectful correspondence, yours faithfully or yours truly were common. For friends, yours affectionately or yours ever would be appropriate. And for a lover, oh, the possibilities were endless. Yours, devotedly, ever thine, or even a simple XO implied with a deep, unspoken intimacy. The wrong closing could imply too much familiarity, or, conversely, a cold distance. It was a subtle dance of social positioning. Even the folding and sealing of the letter were part of the etiquette. As we touched on before, separate envelopes became common. The letter itself was folded so that the address could be written on the outside. The way you folded it, the neatness of the creases, spoke volumes. Then came the wax seal. This wasn't just for security. It was an opportunity for personalization. Many Victorians owned signet rings or personalized wax stamps, often featuring a family crest, a monogram, or a symbolic image. Applying the seal, melting the wax with a taper or a candle, and then pressing the stamp firmly into the molten pool was a ritual in itself. It added a touch of elegance and gravitas to the finished letter. A broken or carelessly applied seal could suggest haste or disrespect. The content of the letter also adhered to unspoken rules. Gossip, while undoubtedly a popular pastime, was often couched in carefully veiled terms, leaving much to the reader's interpretation. Direct criticism was generally avoided, especially in formal letters. Complaints about health were common, almost a standard opening, as illness was a pervasive feature of Victorian life. But one had to be careful not to appear to be fishing for sympathy too aggressively. There was a delicate balance to strike. And what about the timing of replies? It was considered rude to reply too quickly to a social letter, as it might suggest you had nothing better to do. But replying too slowly could imply a lack of interest or respect. It was a social tightrope walk, often requiring a calculated delay. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate strategy to maintain social control, or simply a byproduct of the slower pace of life and communication. Regardless, it certainly added another layer of complexity to Victorian social interactions. The strictures of letter writing were particularly pronounced for those navigating courtship. A young man's letter to a young woman, for instance, would be scrutinized not just by her, but often by her parents. Every phrase, every turn of phrase, could be interpreted as a sign of his character, his intentions, and his suitability as a potential suitor. Similarly, a young woman's reply had to strike a balance between politeness and encouragement without appearing to forward. It was a complex game of literary chess played out on paper. This elaborate system of etiquette might seem overly rigid to us today, accustomed as we are to the informality of emails, texts, and instant messages. But for Victorians, it was a vital part of social lubrication, a way of navigating complex social hierarchies and expressing nuanced relationships. It ensured clarity, conveyed respect, and maintained a certain level of decorum in all interactions. It was a testament to a society that valued formality, order, and the written word as a cornerstone of social life. So, next time you dash off a quick KTTYL, just remember the intricate dance of the Victorian letter writer, carefully choosing every word, every fold, and every flourish to ensure their message and their social standing was perfectly conveyed. Having navigated the intricate dance of Victorian letter-writing etiquette, let's now turn our attention to the physical implements themselves, because, really, what good is knowing how to write if you don't have the right tools? The Victorians, with their penchant for detail and specialized craftsmanship, developed and utilized a fascinating array of materials for their correspondence. This wasn't a world of mass-produced biros and cheap printer paper. Every component, from the paper to the ink and the very pen you held, had a history, a quality, and often a specific purpose. First, let's talk about paper. Before the widespread industrialization of papermaking, paper was often made from rag, pulp, meaning discarded textiles, old clothes, linen, cotton were repurposed into the fibers that formed the sheets. This made for a high-quality, durable paper, often with a lovely texture and a distinct, almost warm feel. It also meant paper could be quite expensive, especially the finer varieties. The Victorians distinguished between various weights and finishes. For casual notes, you might use a thinner, less refined paper. But for formal invitations or important business, a heavy laid paper with a watermark was the standard. A watermark, that subtle, almost invisible design embedded in the paper itself, was a mark of quality and often bore the manufacturer's emblem or a symbol of the paper mill. It was a bit like a designer label today, quietly asserting the paper's pedigree. The color of the paper also mattered. While white and cream were the most common, tinted papers in soft blues, grays, or pinks were sometimes used for more informal or personal correspondence, particularly by women. And then, as we touched on, there was mourning paper. This wasn't just plain black-bordered stationery. The width of the black border on the paper and envelopes indicated the degree and duration of mourning. A very wide black border, perhaps an inch or more, signified the earliest stages of deep mourning, typically for a recent death of a spouse or close family member. As time passed, the border would gradually narrow, perhaps to a quarter-inch, then a thin line, and eventually disappear altogether. This peculiar tidbit served as an instant visual cue to the recipient, informing them of the sender's current state of grief and allowing them to tailor their response accordingly. Imagine getting a letter today with a black border that tells you exactly how recently someone passed away. It's an almost unbelievably direct form of nonverbal communication. Next up, ink. Forget your modern ballpoint pens that deliver a consistent, quick-drying line. Victorian inks were a different beast entirely. The most common was iron gall ink, made from oak galls tree growths caused by insects, iron salts, and a binding agent like gum arabic. When first applied, it often appeared pale blue or gray, but as it oxidized on the paper, it would deepen into a rich, permanent black or deep brown. This oxidizing process is why many old documents, initially written in black ink, now appear sepia-toned. Iron gall ink was renowned for its permanence. It practically became part of the paper fibers, making it incredibly difficult to erase or alter without damaging the document. However, it was also highly acidic, and over centuries, it could literally eat through the paper, leaving behind ghostly outlines or brittle holes. Historians still argue whether the permanence of iron gall ink outweighed its corrosive nature in the long run for document preservation. It was a trade-off, certainly. Beyond black, other ink colors were used, though less commonly for formal correspondence. Blue ink gained popularity later in the century for personal letters, and red ink was sometimes used for emphasis or by stationers for decorative flourishes. But black or dark brown remained the standard for serious communication. The ink had to be mixed carefully, often from powder or concentrated liquid, and its consistency was crucial. Too thick, and it would clog the pen. Too thin, and it would bleed on the paper. Inkwells, often beautiful objects made of glass, ceramic, or even silver, were indispensable, holding a steady supply for dipping. And finally, the instrument that brought ink to paper, the pen. For much of the early Victorian era, the quill pen was still in widespread use, particularly for those who valued tradition or sought a finer line. Made from the flight feathers of large birds, usually geese, quills required constant maintenance. They needed to be sharpened frequently with a penknife, hence the name, to maintain a fine point. Writing with a quill was an art form in itself, demanding a light touch, careful control, and frequent redipping into the inkwell. The distinct scratch, scratch, scratch of a quill pen on paper is a quintessential sound of the era, almost an ASMR experience, if you can imagine it. However, the latter half of the Victorian period saw the ascendancy of the steel nib pen. These pens consisted of a replaceable metal nib, the pointed tip inserted into a holder, usually made of wood, bone, or mother of pearl. Steel nibs offered several advantages over quills. They were far more durable, held more ink, and produced a more consistent line. They were also significantly cheaper to produce, leading to their mass adoption. Different nibs offered different line widths and flexibilities, allowing for a wide range of calligraphic styles. Some nibs were fine for delicate script, others broad for bold headlines. A quirky tidbit is that many companies produced novelty nibs with specific names, like the gilt-pointed nib or the mapping pen, each designed for a particular writing task. This shift from organic quill to manufactured steel was a microcosm of the Industrial Revolution, moving from handcrafted, labor-intensive tools to mass-produced, standardized implements. Of course, no pen was complete without a pen holder. These could range from simple wooden shafts to ornate, jeweled creations, reflecting the owner's taste and wealth. And nearby, you'd find a blotting pad or blotting paper, essential for absorbing excess ink and preventing smudges, especially since Victorian inks were slow to dry. You couldn't just fold your letter instantly. You had to wait for the ink to dry or carefully blot it. Another small but significant ritual in the letter writing process. The meticulous attention paid to these materials speaks volumes about the value Victorians placed on the written word. A letter wasn't just a means of conveying information. It was an artifact, a tangible representation of the sender. The quality of the paper, the richness of the ink, the elegance of the contributed to the message, adding layers of meaning beyond the mere words. It was an age where the physical act of creation was as important as the content itself. So, while you might be accustomed to a quick tap on a keyboard, imagine the sensory experience of a Victorian letter writer, the smooth glide of the nib, the rich scent of iron gall ink, the delicate texture of the paper beneath your fingers. It was a far more immersive and perhaps more meaningful way to communicate. With your carefully chosen paper, your deep black ink, and your preferred steel nib poised in your pen holder, you've begun to compose your Victorian letter. But before you even consider sending it, there's a crucial step that, in our modern age of sealed envelopes, often goes unthought of: the act of sealing and ensuring the security of your correspondence. In a time when privacy was highly valued but often difficult to maintain, Victorians developed an elaborate, sometimes ingenious, array of practices to keep their written words confidential and to authenticate the sender. Let's cast our minds back to the days before mass-produced, gummed envelopes. For much of the early and mid-Victorian era, and certainly for more formal correspondence throughout, letters were folded in a specific, intricate manner so that the address could be written directly onto an exposed panel of the folded paper itself. This meant that the security of your message relied entirely on the effectiveness of your seal. A quirky tidbit for you: some of these folding patterns were incredibly complex, almost like origami, designed to create a tamper-proof package. A poorly folded letter, or one with an inadequate seal, could easily be read by curious eyes, whether those of a nosy family member, an inquisitive servant, or even a postal worker along the chain of delivery. The postal service, while generally trustworthy, wasn't immune to the occasional peak. The primary method of sealing was, of course, with sealing wax. This wasn't just any wax. It was a specially formulated mixture, often made from shellac, turpentine, and various pigments, that melted smoothly and hardened quickly to form a durable, brittle seal. The most common color was red, a vibrant hue that stood out against the paper. But black was also popular, particularly for mourning stationery. Other colors like blue, green, or gold were available for those who desired a more personal touch. The process of sealing was a small ritual in itself. You would light a taper or a candle, holding the stick of sealing wax just above the flame, allowing a pool of molten wax to drip onto the folded edge or intersection of the letter. The trick was to get just enough wax, not too little, which would make a weak seal, and not too much, which would look clumsy and waste precious wax. Once the molten pool was formed, quickly, before it cooled, you would press your signet ring or seal stamp firmly into the hot wax. The impression left behind was not just decorative, it was a mark of identity, a personal signature in wax. Signet rings were incredibly common, passed down through families, or acquired as a mark of status. They typically featured a family crest, a monogram, intertwined initials, or a symbolic image. For those without a signet ring, small handheld seal stamps were readily available, often with a similar array of designs. The choice of design could also convey subtle messages. A family crest indicated a sense of tradition and lineage, while a more personal symbol might hint at an individual's interests or allegiances. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of personalized seals was primarily a matter of security, a display of status, or simply an aesthetic preference for elegant closure. Most likely, it was a combination of all three. The integrity of the wax seal was paramount. A broken or disturbed seal indicated that the letter might have been opened and read by someone other than the intended recipient. This was a serious matter, a breach of privacy, and could lead to significant social awkwardness or even scandal. Imagine the anxiety of seeing a letter arrive with a suspiciously cracked seal, knowing your most private thoughts might have been exposed. For particularly sensitive correspondence, individuals might use multiple seals along the edges of the letter, making it even harder to tamper with unnoticed. Beyond wax seals, other less common but equally intriguing methods of security existed. Some individuals might use a fine thread or ribbon woven through small slits in the paper and then sealed with wax. This added an extra layer of difficulty, for anyone attempting to open the letter without detection. For those sending highly sensitive information, invisible inks were occasionally employed, though these were more the stuff of spies and secret societies than everyday correspondence. More practically, some would incorporate specific paper tears or perforations that, if disturbed, would indicate tampering. These were often subtle and known only to the sender and recipient, a kind of predigital security feature. Consider also the implied security of reputation. In a society where social standing was everything, deliberately opening someone else's mail was a grave offense, carrying significant social penalties if discovered. While direct legal repercussions might have been limited, the damage to one's reputation could be severe, akin to a modern-day data breach. The threat of social ostracism often served as a deterrent, augmenting the physical security provided by seals. The practices surrounding sealing also extended to the delivery process. For very important or urgent letters, a sender might employ a private messenger rather than relying solely on the public postal service. This allowed for direct, hand-to-hand delivery, bypassing some of the potential vulnerabilities of the broader network. While more expensive, it offered an unparalleled level of security and immediacy. This wasn't a frequent occurrence for the average person, of course, but for legal documents, business contracts, or extremely sensitive personal news, it was the preferred method. The evolution of envelope use also played a role in the changing nature of security. As gummed envelopes became more widely available and affordable, particularly after the 1840s, they simplified the sealing process. The pre-glued flap meant less fuss with wax, although many still chose to add a wax seal for tradition, extra security, or aesthetic appeal. The envelope itself, once a luxury, became a common feature, providing a primary layer of opaque privacy. No longer was your address written directly onto the outside of your folded letter. Now it was discreetly enclosed, protecting the very personal nature of the message within dots. So, while the act of sealing a letter might seem like a quaint, almost theatrical gesture today, for Victorians, it was a serious business. It was about protecting privacy, asserting identity, and ensuring the integrity of their communication in a world that, despite its slower pace, was just as concerned with trust and confidentiality as our own. The satisfying crack of a wax seal, broken by the eager recipient, wasn't just a sound. It was the symbolic opening of a private world, a direct connection between two minds, secured by tradition, ingenuity, and a lump of hardened resin. It reminds you that even without digital encryption, people found ways to safeguard their secrets. Having covered the nuts and bolts of Victorian letter writing, the paper, the ink, the seals, let's now delve into the nuanced world of style and tone, because in an age where letters were a primary form of communication, knowing whether to write a formal missive or a casual note was absolutely critical. This wasn't just about personal preference. It was about adhering to rigid social codes that dictated everything from your opening pleasantries to your choice of vocabulary. Misjudging the appropriate level of formality could lead to social gaffes, misunderstandings, or even unintentional offense. Imagine you're a Victorian preparing to write. Your first thought, after considering the topic, would undoubtedly be, who am I writing to, and what is our relationship? This question determined everything. For formal correspondence, the rules were clear. and unyielding. This category encompassed business letters, official inquiries, invitations to significant social events like balls or grand dinners, letters to social superiors, or communications concerning sensitive matters. The language was expected to be precise, dignified, and often quite elaborate. Politeness was paramount, bordering on deferential. Especially when addressing someone of higher social standing, you would typically begin with a very formal salutation, such as Sir, Madam, My Lord, or Your Grace, depending on the recipient's title and status. The opening lines would be polite and often impersonal, perhaps acknowledging a previous communication or stating the purpose of the letter directly, but always with a respectful tone. For instance, I trust this letter finds you in good health, or I am writing to inquire about ... double quotes would be common beginnings. The body of the letter would maintain a serious, measured tone, avoiding anything too personal or casual. Complex sentence structures and a rich vocabulary were hallmarks of formal writing, demonstrating the sender's education and refinement. Colloquialisms, slang, or overly familiar expressions were strictly forbidden. The closing of a formal letter was equally prescriptive. Phrases like, I remain, Sir, your most obedient servant, yours faithfully, or yours respectfully, were standard. This wasn't merely rote, it expressed a specific social relationship. The obedient servant sign-off, which sounds almost subservient to our modern ears, was simply a conventional mark of deep respect and deference in that era. A quirky tidbit for you that belies its literal meaning. Historians still argue whether such elaborate deference was genuinely felt or merely a performative aspect of Victorian social ritual. Likely, it was a bit of both, a comfortable habit that reinforced societal structures. Now, shift your focus to informal correspondence. This was the realm of family letters, notes between close friends, and communications with trusted confidants. Here, the strictures loosened considerably, allowing for a more conversational, personal, and emotionally expressive style. Salutations could be warm and affectionate. My dearest sister, my darling Charles, dearest friend. The opening lines would often plunge directly into personal news, gossip, or expressions of affection. I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Or it has been far too long since we last corresponded, would set a much more intimate tone. The language itself would mirror spoken conversation more closely, though still maintaining a certain level of propriety. Contractions were more acceptable, as were personal anecdotes, humorous observations, and expressions of feeling. This was where the true personality of the writer could shine through. Informal letters were also the place for sharing intimate details of daily life, descriptions of new dresses, accounts of social calls, complaints about one's health, a ubiquitous topic, or musings on books and events. This rich tapestry of personal detail is why informal Victorian letters are such a treasure trove for historians, offering a window into the lived experiences and emotional landscapes of the past. The closing for informal letters was equally varied and telling, reflecting the intimacy of the relationship. Yours affectionately, with love, ever yours, devotedly, or even just your loving daughter, son, friend, were common. A mother might sign off to her child with your loving mama, while a lover might choose something far more passionate and exclusive. The choice here was subtle but significant. signaling the depth and nature of the bond. It's important to remember that these two categories, formal and informal, weren't always strictly black and white. There was a spectrum. A letter to a distant cousin might fall somewhere in the middle, requiring a respectful but not overly formal tone. A letter from a younger person to an elder, even within the family, might lean more towards formality out of deference. Social class also played a role. While the conventions applied across society, the specific nuances and the quality of execution often reflected one's education and social circles. One of the curious aspects of Victorian informal correspondence was the sheer volume and frequency, especially within families. With no phones or easy travel, letters were the lifeline that connected relatives scattered across the country or even the empire. Daily or weekly letters between family members were not uncommon, detailing mundane occurrences, sharing joys and sorrows, and maintaining a continuous thread of connection. This fostered a particular kind of intimacy, one built on shared narratives conveyed through the written word, quite different from our modern, fragmented digital conversations. The blending of sensory detail and emotion in these personal letters is fascinating. You'd read descriptions of the weather, the blooming of flowers in the garden, the taste of a particular meal, or the chill in the air roll, designed to transport the recipient into the sender's world. This vivid imagery created a shared experience, almost a form of time travel for both the writer and the reader. And despite the occasional gentle sarcasm or subtle humor, the underlying tone was generally one of earnestness and genuine connection. Victorian letters, even the most informal, often carried a weight of sincerity that might feel unfamiliar in our current age of ironic detachment. So, while the penny black made it cheap to send a letter, the mastery of formal and informal styles was the key to sending the right letter. It was a complex system of social signaling, demonstrating respect, affection, or deference, all through the careful choice of words and phrases. It speaks to a time when written communication was both an art form and a vital social skill, a reflection of one's place in a carefully ordered society. It makes you realize how many unspoken rules we still navigate in our digital communications today, even if they're far less rigid than the Victorians. Having delved into the subtle nuances of formal and informal Victorian correspondence, let's hone in on a specific, yet incredibly pervasive, example of the latter, the thank you note. You might think, a thank you note, how peculiar can that be? But in Victorian society, the thank you note was elevated to an art form, a crucial social lubricant, and a mandatory demonstration of good manners. To neglect sending one was not merely impolite. It was a grave social misstep that could genuinely damage your reputation and standing. Imagine yourself, a young woman perhaps, having just attended a delightful dinner party at the home of a prominent family. The food was exquisite, the company charming, the conversation stimulating. You arrive home, perhaps a little tired, but still buzzing from the evening. Your first inclination might be to collapse into bed. But in the Victorian era, as soon as practicable, certainly within a day or two, your pen would be poised. The thank you note, specifically the bread and butter letter, as it was often called when acknowledging hospitality, was not optional. It was an absolute requirement. The purpose of the thank you note went beyond mere politeness. it served several critical functions. Firstly, it formally acknowledged the hospitality received, demonstrating that you valued the effort and expense the host had put into the event. Secondly, it reinforced social ties and obligations, signaling that you understood the reciprocity inherent in social interactions. Thirdly, it offered an opportunity to reiterate your enjoyment of the occasion, thus complimenting the host and subtly encouraging future invitations. And finally, for the writer, it was a practical exercise in demonstrating their good breeding, education, and attention to detail. The form of the thank you note was generally informal, using lighter paper and a more personal tone, but it still adhered to certain conventions. It would typically begin with a warm salutation, expressing immediate gratitude for the recent event. For instance, "My dearest Mrs. Davies, I must express my sincerest thanks for the delightful evening at your charming home last Tuesday." You would then elaborate, providing specific details that showed your genuine appreciation and that you weren't merely writing a generic note. You might mention a particular conversation you enjoyed, a fascinating guest you met, a dish you found especially delicious, or a piece of music performed. This level of detail was a quirky tidbit that distinguished a truly thoughtful thank you from a perfunctory one. It proved you were present, engaged, and observant. For example, you might write, "The quail was cooked to perfection, and I particularly enjoyed my conversation with your cousin, Mr. Allister, on the surprising merits of subterranean exploration. His anecdotes truly brightened the evening." Such specific mentions made the note feel personal and sincere. Avoiding generic praise, "It was a nice party," was key. The brevity of the thank you note was also important. It wasn't meant to be a lengthy discourse, but a concise expression of gratitude. Usually, it would be no more than a page, often less, getting straight to the point without unnecessary preamble. The language, while informal, would remain elegant and free of slang or excessive familiarity, especially if the recipient was not an extremely close friend or family member. The promptness of sending the thank you note was another crucial aspect. Delaying for too long could be interpreted as rudeness, carelessness, or a lack of appreciation. The general rule of thumb was within 24 to 48 hours of the event. Imagine the pressure, especially after a particularly lively social season, when you might be attending multiple engagements a week. Historians still argue whether this strict adherence to timeliness was a genuine reflection of social conscience, or simply a mechanism for maintaining social order and hierarchy. Regardless, it certainly kept the postal service busy. Beyond hospitality, thank you notes were expected for gifts, acts of kindness, or any special favor. Receiving a gift, no matter how small, necessitated a written acknowledgement. If a friend offered assistance during a difficult time, a thoughtful thank you letter expressing your appreciation for their support was absolutely mandatory. These notes served to solidify bonds, express genuine warmth, and reciprocate kindness, albeit in written form, for children. Writing thank you notes was an early lesson in social conduct and a crucial part of their upbringing. You can imagine a stern governess overseeing a child's careful penmanship. It instilled discipline and a lifelong habit of expressing gratitude in a tangible way. This emphasis on early etiquette training ensured that the practice continued through generations. The thank you note also acted as a subtle form of social ledger. By sending one, You confirmed your participation in the social sphere, acknowledged your debt of gratitude, and positioned yourself for future interactions. Failure to send one could result in you being silently dropped from future guest lists, a far more chilling consequence than a stern word. It was a form of social currency, exchanged and accumulated through diligent practice, the widespread expectation of thank you. Notes meant that Victorians often spent a considerable amount of time corresponding, even about seemingly small matters. It wasn't just about the grand announcements or the urgent news. It was about the continuous maintenance of social relationships through regular, thoughtful communication. This steady stream of polite acknowledgments formed the very backbone of Victorian social networks, ensuring that every kindness was recognized and every favor appreciated. So, while we might casually send a quick THX for dinner, text today, remember the Victorian earnestness. The thank you note was not a throwaway gesture. It was a deeply ingrained social obligation, a finely tuned instrument of politeness, and a vital tool for navigating the complex currents of Victorian society. It reminds us that even the simplest acts of gratitude can be imbued with profound social meaning, reflecting a society that valued formality, reciprocity, and the enduring power of the written word. From the polite obligations of the thank you note, we now glide, perhaps a little more blushingly, into one of the most fascinating and emotionally charged categories of Victorian correspondence: love letters and courtship rituals. If the formal business letter was a stiff collar and the family letter a comfortable shawl, then the Victorian love letter was a whispered secret, a passionate declaration, often fraught with anxiety, hope, and the intricate dance of social propriety. In an era where direct public displays of affection were frowned upon and chaperones were ubiquitous, the written word became the primary conduit for expressing romantic interest, navigating the delicate process of courtship and nurturing burgeoning affections. Imagine a young man smitten but unable to speak freely with the object of his desires in person. Perhaps they met at a ball, exchanged a few fleeting words, a meaningful glance across a crowded drawing room. His next step often would be a carefully crafted letter. This was not a casual text message. Oh no, this was a weighty document, a piece of his very soul laid bare, albeit within the confines of Victorian decorum. The initial letters in a courtship were masterpieces of subtle intention. They couldn't be too forward, too passionate, or they risked appearing presumptuous and could lead to a swift rebuff. Yet they had to convey enough interest to encourage a reply. A common strategy was to begin with a seemingly innocuous reason for writing a polite inquiry about her health, a reference to their last meeting, or perhaps a shared interest in literature or music. Within these polite phrases, however, would be embedded a more personal, slightly yearning tone. He might express how much he enjoyed her company, how her wit delighted him, or how he found himself thinking of her long after their encounter. For the young woman receiving such a letter, the interpretation was key. Was it merely a polite social gesture, or was it a preliminary declaration of interest? Her reply, in turn, would be equally calibrated. She couldn't appear too eager, lest she be seen as immodest. But too cold a response would risk discouraging a genuine suitor. Her letter might offer a polite acknowledgement, perhaps a gentle encouragement, or a subtle redirection if she wasn't interested. This was a delicate, drawn-out ballet of words. Each phrase a step, a hesitation, or an invitation. A quirky tidbit for you. The sheer volume of how-to guides on writing love letters that appeared in Victorian times speaks volumes about the anxiety surrounding this process. These guides offered sample phrases, advice on tone, and warnings against common pitfalls. It was almost as if romantic expression, traditionally spontaneous, had become a learned skill, carefully honed for public consumption. Historians still argue whether this systematization of love letter writing stifled genuine emotion or merely provided a necessary framework for expression in a highly constrained society. As the courtship progressed, and if mutual interest grew, the letters would become increasingly personal and passionate. Pet names might appear, veiled references to future hopes and dreams, and bolder declarations of affection. The language, while still formal by our standards, would grow more intimate and revealing. Secret symbols or phrases might be exchanged, known only to the lovers, adding another layer of privacy and shared understanding. A particular flower pressed within the letter, a lock of hair enclosed, or a faint scent of perfume could all carry profound romantic meaning. Consider the role of the postal service in this unfolding drama. Each letter, carried by the penny post, was a lifeline. Waiting for a reply could be an agony. The arrival of the postman, once a source of anxiety about fees, now became a moment of intense anticipation. A delayed letter could lead to sleepless nights, imagined slights, or even mistaken assumptions about a faltering affection. The reliability of the postal system, though generally excellent after the reforms, still had its limits, and those limits could feel excruciating when a heart was on the line. Sealing these love letters was particularly important. The wax seal, often bearing a romantic motif like a heart, a dove, or intertwined initials, served not just as a mark of authenticity, but as a declaration of privacy. The act of breaking the seal was almost symbolic of entering the sacred space of the beloved's deepest thoughts. Imagine a young woman carefully breaking the seal on a letter from her suitor, her heart pounding with anticipation. Every word, every flourish of his hand would be scrutinized for meaning. For engaged couples, letters could become even more intimate, serving as a substitute for the physical proximity often denied before marriage. They might discuss their hopes for their future home, their children, or the challenges they anticipated. These letters helped to build an emotional foundation for the marriage, allowing them to truly get to know each other's minds in a way that restricted social interactions often precluded. However, not all courtship letters ended happily. The Victorian era was also one of social mobility and strict class distinctions. A letter might convey a polite refusal, a no couched in terms of regret and social obligation, rather than a direct rejection. Or, perhaps more devastatingly, a letter might arrive announcing a broken engagement, or the news of a suitor's sudden departure or ill health. The written word, while a source of joy, could also be an instrument of profound heartbreak. The role of parents in this process was often significant. Letters might be intercepted, scrutinized, or even dictated. A young woman's parents might insist on reviewing her correspondence, particularly if a suitor was not deemed entirely suitable. This added another layer of complexity and subterfuge to the art of the love letter. with couples often resorting to coded language or hidden messages to bypass parental surveillance. This constant parental oversight, while stifling by modern standards, was seen as essential to protecting a young woman's reputation and ensuring a suitable match. In essence, Victorian love letters were more than just messages. They were artifacts of emotion, strategic instruments in the delicate game of courtship, and enduring testaments to the power of the written word to bridge distance and social barriers. They reveal a society deeply invested in structured romance, where passion was often expressed through eloquent prose rather than impulsive acts. So, the next time you send a quick wid to your significant other, just remember the painstaking effort, the subtle codes, and the burning anticipation that went into a Victorian love letter. It truly was a peculiar and often beautiful dance of words. From the thrilling, heart-fluttering realm of love letters, we now transition to a far more somber, yet equally ritualized, aspect of Victorian letter writing: mourning stationery and the communication of sympathy. In a society where death was a far more ubiquitous and public presence than it is today, the rituals surrounding grief were elaborate, specific, and deeply embedded in social custom. And just as with joyful occasions, the written word played a crucial role in navigating the difficult landscape of loss, expressing condolences and acknowledging remembrance. Imagine a Victorian household plunged into mourning. The immediate aftermath of a death was marked by strict adherence to specific social protocols. One of the most visible indicators of this was the use of specialized mourning stationery. This wasn't merely a stylistic choice, it was a societal expectation, a visual announcement of grief that instantly communicated the sender's emotional state and the recent loss they had experienced. As we touched upon briefly before, mourning paper and envelopes were characterized by black borders. But this wasn't a static design. The width of the black border was a critical indicator of the stage of mourning the sender was in, and thus the recency and depth of their grief. A very wide, heavy black border, sometimes an inch or more, signified the earliest and deepest phase of mourning, typically worn for a spouse, parent, or child within the first few months. This deep mourning period could last for a year or even longer, depending on the relationship. As time progressed and the mourning period softened, the border would gradually narrow, perhaps to a quarter-inch, then a thin line, until it eventually disappeared entirely as the individual transitioned out of formal mourning. This peculiar tidbit meant that a recipient could instantly gauge the sender's current emotional state and tailor their response accordingly, without even reading a word of the letter itself. It was a silent, yet powerfully communicative signal. The choice of ink also sometimes reflected the somber mood, with black ink being the standard, reinforcing the gravity of the message. The paper itself was often of a heavier, more subdued quality than other types of stationery. The overall aesthetic was one of understated solemnity, designed to convey respect for the deceased and empathy for the bereaved. When composing a letter of condolence, the language was expected to be empathetic, respectful, and appropriately formal. It was crucial to avoid anything that might seem frivolous, overly cheerful, or insincere. The purpose was to offer comfort, acknowledge the loss, and express sympathy. Common phrases would include, "I was deeply grieved to hear of your recent bereavement," or my heart goes out to you in this time of sorrow. Rather than offering platitudes about the deceased being in a better place immediately, which could be seen as insensitive, expressions of shared sorrow and admiration for the departed were more common. For instance, he was a man of great integrity, and I shall always remember his kindness. It was also important to acknowledge the impact of the loss on the bereaved. You might write, "I can only imagine the depth of your sorrow," or, "Please know that my thoughts are with you during this incredibly difficult time." Offering practical assistance, if genuinely possible, was also a thoughtful gesture. Should there be anything at all I can do to assist you, please do not hesitate to call upon me. However, such offers had to be sincere. Empty gestures were easily seen through. Historians still argue whether the elaborate rituals of Victorian mourning, including the specific stationery and prescriptive language, genuinely helped people process grief or merely imposed a rigid social structure on a deeply personal experience. It was likely a complex interplay, providing both a framework for expression and, at times, a burden of expectation. Beyond direct condolences, letters in mourning periods also often dealt with practical matters related to the death, funeral, arrangements, legal affairs, or the settlement of estates. Even in these practical communications, a respectful and somber tone was maintained. The formal aspects of the letter served to underscore the solemnity of the occasion. Receiving letters of condolence was a vital part of the grieving process for Victorian. It was a tangible demonstration of community support, showing the bereaved that they were not alone in their sorrow. The sheer volume of correspondence during a period of mourning could be overwhelming, yet each letter served as a small comfort, a reminder of the connections that bound society together. Consider the journey of such a letter, from the quiet solemnity of its composition through the busy, bustling postal network to its arrival at a home shrouded in grief. The postman, usually a familiar figure, might approach with a more somber demeanor when delivering such mail. The breaking of the seal on a black-bordered envelope was always a moment of quiet dread, confirming the sad news within. The etiquette surrounding mourning extended beyond the immediate family to broader social circles. Friends, acquaintances, and even business associates were expected to send their condolences. Missing this social obligation could be interpreted as a grave slight, suggesting a lack of empathy or respect. Therefore, even those who might not have been particularly close to the deceased felt compelled to send a proper letter of sympathy, adhering to the prescribed format and tone. One quirky tidbit reflecting the pervasive nature of mourning was the development of specialized mourning cards or funeral cards. These were small, often black-edged cards bearing the name of the deceased, dates of birth and death, and sometimes a verse or prayer, which were sent out by the bereaved family to inform a wider circle of the death and funeral arrangements. These served as a more concise, formal announcement than a full letter, yet still conveyed the appropriate solemnity. The long periods of mourning, often extending for a year or even two for a widow, meant that mourning stationery remained in use for a significant duration. It was a constant, public reminder of loss, but also a symbol of fidelity and respect for the departed. This pervasive visibility of grief, communicated through dress codes, social withdrawal, and of course, stationery, meant that the Victorian society was constantly acknowledging and ritualizing death. So, while the somber nature of mourning letters might seem distant from our own practices of quick texts of sympathy, they reveal a profound societal engagement with grief. The meticulous care taken in composing and presenting these letters underscores the depth of emotion and the stringent social expectations surrounding death in the Victorian era. It reminds us that even in sorrow, or perhaps especially in sorrow, the Victorians found solace and expression in the deliberate, tactile act of putting pen to paper. From the stark, somber reality of mourning stationery, we now pivot to a more playful, yet equally intricate, aspect of Victorian communication, the intriguing world of secret codes and hidden meanings embedded within letters. You might think of Victorians as straight-laced and overly formal, but beneath that polished exterior often lay a surprising penchant for subtle subversion, particularly when direct communication was constrained by social norms, parental oversight, or the ever-present, prying eyes of servants and busybodies. In a society where propriety was paramount, veiled messages became an art form, allowing for expressions of affection, dissent, or shared secrets without overtly breaking the rules. Imagine, for a moment, a young couple conducting a clandestine courtship, or friends sharing gossip that simply couldn't be committed to plain prose. How would they communicate without fear of interception or misinterpretation by unwanted readers? The answer often lay in a fascinating array of subtle cues, symbolic gestures, and even a peculiar form of visual cryptography. One of the most widespread and perhaps charming methods of conveying hidden meanings was through the language of flowers, or floriography. While not strictly part of letter writing in terms of prose, it was a common accompanying gesture. A small pressed flower, or even a drawing of one, tucked into a letter, could convey a profound message. A red rose meant love, a lily of the valley, return of happiness, and a yellow rose, rather tragically, often signaled jealousy or decrease of love. The sender and recipient would often consult popular floriography dictionaries to decipher these botanical missives. This peculiar tidbit meant that a simple bouquet or a carefully chosen sprig enclosed in a letter became a rich, coded conversation, bypassing the need for explicit words. Historians still argue whether floriography was truly a common functional language for secrets or more of a romantic novelty for the well-educated elite. It was likely a blend, with its full subtleties perhaps understood by only a select few. Beyond flowers, the very presentation of the letter could carry unspoken messages. The color of the sealing wax, for instance, could sometimes be imbued with meaning. Red wax, as we know, was standard, but a black seal signified mourning. White wax might denote peace or friendship, while green could hint at hope or news. Of course, this wasn't a universally codified system, but within certain circles, these colors could add another layer to the communication. Then there was the placement of the stamp. While postage stamps were primarily functional, stories and popular lore suggest that the way a stamp was affixed to an envelope could convey a secret message, particularly in romantic correspondence. A stamp placed upside down might mean "I love you," while one placed diagonally could signify "I miss you." A stamp placed on the top right corner, right side up, might simply be friendship. The possibilities, though perhaps more anecdotal than strictly codified, were numerous. Imagine the agony of a hopeful suitor examining a stamp placement, trying to decipher if their affections were reciprocated. This unspoken language, relying on shared knowledge between sender and receiver, allowed for discretion, for more direct hidden messages within the text itself. Victorians sometimes employed simple forms of steganography, concealing a message within another, seemingly innocent message. This could involve using specific words or phrases that had a prearranged double meaning. For example, a seemingly mundane discussion about the weather might secretly refer to a plan for an illicit meeting. The fog is quite thick tonight could mean the coast is clear for our rendezvous. This required a prior agreement or a shared context between the correspondents, making it incredibly difficult for an outsider to detect another method. Often employed by those concerned about their letters being opened and read was the use of invisible ink. While perhaps more the stuff of spy novels, homemade invisible inks were known and sometimes used. Lemon juice, milk, or vinegar could be written with drying invisible on the paper. The message would then be revealed by heating the paper over a candle or iron. This was a relatively high-risk strategy, as obvious scorch marks might alert suspicious parties, and it speaks to the lengths some would go to ensure privacy. More commonly, however, was the art of subtext and implication. This was not a formal code, but a mastery of writing between the lines. Victorians, adept at polite circumlocution, excelled at conveying nuanced meanings through careful phrasing, subtle hints, and knowing omissions. A carefully worded query, a seemingly innocent comment, or a pointed absence of certain details could all carry significant weight for the informed reader. This required a deep understanding of social context and the personalities involved. It was a game of read between the lines, where much was implied and little explicitly stated. A light joke might conceal a serious warning, or an innocuous observation might convey profound disappointment. Consider also the phenomenon of cross-writing, or crossed letters, as a form of unintentional or sometimes intentional obscurity. While primarily done to save on postage costs by maximizing space on a single sheet of paper, writing horizontally, then turning the paper 90 degrees and writing over the previous text vertically. This practice made letters incredibly difficult. To read this convoluted script, a quirky tidbit born of economic necessity, could unintentionally serve as a barrier to casual readers, deterring anyone but the most determined decipherer. Imagine a nosy servant trying to make sense of that chaotic jumble of words. Even the choice of stationery itself, beyond the morning specifics, could carry subtle weight. The quality of the paper, the color, or a particular embossed monogram could all signal status, a shared affiliation, or even a subtle flirtation. These were often not secret codes in the cryptographic sense, but rather shared understandings within a particular social set, providing an additional layer of meaning that only the initiated would fully grasp. Historians grapple with the extent to which these various subtle codes and techniques were truly widespread versus being isolated instances or literary embellishments. While it's clear they weren't universally applied, their very existence speaks to a pervasive need for discretion in a society that valued appearances and control. The pressure to conform often led to ingenious methods of circumventing directness. making communication a complex tapestry of explicit and implicit messages. So, while the image of a Victorian might be one of stiff formality, remember that beneath the surface, a vibrant, subtle world of hidden meanings and secret communication often thrived, from the silent language of flowers to the calculated placement of a stamp, and the intricate dance of subtext. Victorians found ingenious ways to express what could not be openly said. It reminds us that privacy and the desire for discreet communication are timeless human needs, adapted to whatever technological and social constraints exist. Having explored the hidden messages Victorians wove into their letters, let's now shift our focus from the art of writing to the arduous reality of delivering these peculiar missives. Because no matter how beautifully penned or cleverly coded, a letter was useless if it couldn't reach its intended recipient. The Victorian postal service, particularly after the penny black reforms, was a marvel of its age, but it was also a complex beast, fraught with logistical hurdles, human challenges, and the occasional, almost comical, mishap. The journey of your meticulously crafted letter from your hand to another's was often an adventure in itself. Imagine the sheer volume of mail. After the penny post, the number of letters sent skyrocketed from tens of millions to hundreds of millions annually. This wasn't just a gradual increase. It was an explosion, and the General Post Office GPO in London, along with its regional counterparts, had to scramble to keep up. This massive influx meant that the sorting offices, often vast, cavernous spaces, were scenes of constant, frenetic activity. You'd find clerks hunched over enormous tables, rapidly sorting letters by destination, their hands a blur as they worked through endless piles. The noise, the dust, the pressure to maintain efficiency was a far cry from the serene image of someone writing a letter in a quiet parlor. One of the primary logistical challenges was transportation. While railway networks expanded rapidly throughout the Victorian era, revolutionizing long-distance mail delivery, they weren't everywhere, and certainly not in the early days. Mail coaches, those iconic horse-drawn vehicles, continued to operate on many routes, battling bad weather, treacherous roads, and the occasional highwayman, though the latter became less common as law enforcement improved. For you, the sender, your letter might begin its journey in a local collection box, be picked up by a local carrier, taken to a smaller sorting office, then transported by rail to a major hub, sorted again, put onto another train, then perhaps a mail cart, and finally delivered by a postman on foot. It was a multimodal relay race. Consider the complexity of scheduling. Mail trains ran at specific times, and missing a connection meant significant delays. Sorting had to be incredibly precise and rapid to ensure letters made their designated trains. The GPO even developed specialized mail trains, which were essentially mobile sorting offices, allowing mail to be sorted en route, a truly innovative solution to the mounting volume. This meant that by the time the train pulled into a major city, much of the sorting for that destination was already done, significantly speeding up delivery times. This was a mainstream historical fact that completely revolutionized postal logistics. Beyond the major arteries, rural delivery presented its own set of problems. In remote villages and hamlets, mail delivery was often sporadic and relied on local arrangements. A villager might trek to the nearest town once a week to collect and dispatch mail for the entire community. or a local carrier, perhaps an elderly woman pushing a cart, might be responsible for a wide, dispersed area. These were often unsung heroes of the postal service, facing long walks in all weathers, navigating muddy tracks, and dealing with potentially hostile farm dogs. The quaint image of a postman whistling merrily was often tempered by the harsh realities of their daily grind. Weather was a constant adversary. Heavy snow, torrential rain, or thick fog could bring the entire system to a grinding halt. Railways might be blocked, roads impassable, and river crossings dangerous. A letter might be delayed for days or even weeks due to a particularly harsh winter or a widespread flood. There was no real-time tracking, no automated updates about delays. You simply waited, perhaps anxiously, for your reply, with no way of knowing where your letter was in the vast, weather-dependent network. And then there was the human element. While Victorian post office employees were generally known for their diligence and honesty, the sheer number of people handling mail meant that occasional errors and even instances of pilfering were inevitable. A letter might be sent to the wrong town or simply lost in the vast machinery of the GPO. While rare, a letter containing cash or valuables was particularly vulnerable. This led to the development of registered mail services, offering a more secure, albeit more expensive, option for sending important items. A quirky tidbit for you. One of the more unusual challenges was the occasional attempt to send live animals through the post. While not strictly letters, the GPO had to contend with people trying to mail everything from chickens to snakes, often with disastrous results for the animal and considerable consternation for the postal workers. Regulations had to be constantly updated to prohibit such peculiar parcels, highlighting the public's sometimes creative, sometimes bewildering interpretation of what constituted mail. Historians still argue whether these attempts were born of genuine ignorance or a mischievous challenge to authority. Either way, it certainly added a bit of unexpected excitement to a postman's day. The sheer scale of operations also led to bureaucratic challenges. Sorting offices had to develop complex systems for handling returned mail, readdressing incorrectly labeled letters, and managing the vast sums of money collected from services like money orders. It was a massive administrative undertaking, requiring meticulous record-keeping and a highly organized workforce. Despite these challenges, the Victorian Postal Service was remarkably efficient for its time. It connected an expanding empire, facilitated trade, and allowed millions to maintain personal relationships across vast distances. The reforms, spurred by the penny black, were not just about affordability. They forced a rapid modernization of logistics and infrastructure that had ripple effects across the entire country. The uniform, predictable system it created was a testament to Victorian ingenuity and their drive for progress. So, when you consider the journey of a Victorian letter, remember that it wasn't just a simple slip of paper. It was an object that weathered storms, navigated complex transport networks, and passed through countless hands, all to fulfill its singular purpose, to connect one human being to another. It makes our own slow postal service seem positively instant by comparison, and gives you a renewed appreciation for the often unseen complexity of delivering a simple message. Having traversed the logistical maze of Victorian mail delivery, Let's now turn our attention to the individuals who were the very embodiment of the postal service, the letter carriers, or postmen as they became widely known. These were not just anonymous figures. They were familiar faces in every community, bringing news, both good and bad, connecting families, and sometimes even becoming figures of local legend. Their daily rounds were a blend of routine labor, community interaction, and occasionally, surprisingly peculiar encounters, making them both heroes of communication and, in some rare instances, unwitting participants in minor local dramas. Imagine the postman's uniform, a practical, often dark blue or black suit, perhaps with a top hat in the early days, later evolving into more practical peaked caps. He carried a heavy leather mailbag, often laden with hundreds of letters, and usually walked his rounds, covering many miles a day, regardless of the weather. For you, the resident, his arrival was a significant event. The sound of his knock, or the distinctive rattle of the letterbox, signaled the potential arrival of news from afar. It was a moment of anticipation, often of joy, sometimes of sorrow, and the postman was the bearer of it all. The postman's role was far more personal than simply dropping mail through a slot. In many communities, especially smaller towns and rural areas, he knew the residents by name, understood their local gossip, and was often privy to the intimate details of their lives through the letters he delivered. He might wait for a moment while a servant signed for a parcel, or politely inquire after a sick family member whose condition he'd gleaned from the tone of the letters he'd recently delivered to the household. He was a trusted, almost familial figure. This mainstream historical fact of personal interaction made the postman a cornerstone of community life, a stark contrast to our largely anonymous delivery services today. Their daily routine was grueling. Before the widespread use of bicycles, and certainly before motorized vehicles, postmen covered vast distances on foot, often in all weathers. Rain, snow, wind, or blistering sun, the mail had to go through. Their commitment to their duty was remarkable, and stories of their perseverance in the face of floods, blizzards, or even local unrest abound. They were often admired for their resilience and dedication. However, the life of a postman wasn't without its challenges or its quirks. One common occupational hazard was dogs. A postman's daily route often involved navigating countless gates, gardens, and barking canines, some of which were less than friendly. Anecdotes of close calls, torn trousers, and frantic retreats from territorial pets were common. This persistent threat added a layer of low-level peril to an otherwise mundane profession. Then there were the truly peculiar deliveries. As we briefly touched on, some individuals would attempt to send items through the post that were clearly not intended for postal delivery. While not necessarily the fault of the postman, he was the one who had to contend with the aftermath. This could range from the slightly absurd, like trying to mail a human skull, a macabre but documented incident, to the utterly bizarre. A quirky tidbit for you: there are reports of individuals trying to mail children, often babies, usually accompanied by an adult, claiming the child was male to take advantage of cheaper parcel rates for travel. While such attempts were quickly prohibited and never condoned, the sheer audacity of them highlights the peculiar interpretations some had of the postal service, and the unusual situations postmen occasionally found themselves in. Historians still argue whether these extreme cases were rare anomalies or indicative of a broader, peculiar disregard for postal regulations. Postmen also sometimes found themselves caught in the middle of local disputes or family dramas. A letter might contain news of a scandal, a financial crisis, or a broken engagement. The postman, if he knew the family, might feel the weight of that impending news as he approached the door. He was a silent, often unwitting, bearer of fate, delivering the catalyst for joy or sorrow. In some cases, he might even be asked to perform small favors, like passing on a verbal message or waiting for a quick reply to be penned, especially in rural areas where the next collection might be days away. This blurred the lines between official duty and community service. The public's relationship with postmen was generally one of respect and trust. The GPO instilled a strong sense of honesty and duty in its employees, and the postman was seen as a reliable, incorruptible figure. Cases of postmen stealing mail were rare and met with severe punishment, ensuring the integrity of the system. This trustworthiness was vital, as so much of Victorian life, from business transactions to personal intimacy, relied on the safe and secure passage of letters. As the Victorian era progressed and populations grew, the postman's roots became denser, and the personal connection, while still present, became somewhat more diluted in larger urban centers. The sheer volume of mail meant less time for pleasantries and more focus on efficiency. Yet, even in bustling London, the sight of the red-uniformed postman on his rounds remained a comforting and familiar part of daily life. The postman, in essence, was the living, breathing link in the vast chain of Victorian communication. He braved the elements, navigated complex social landscapes, and bore the weight of countless personal stories in his mailbag. He was a symbol of reliability, connection, and the quiet diligence that kept the wheels of Victorian society turning. So, next time you wave to your mail carrier, or simply pick up your mail from the box, remember his Victorian predecessor, trudging through the mud, dodging dogs, and carrying the hopes and fears of an entire era, all for a few pennies. It was a peculiar, yet utterly vital, occupation. Having admired the tireless efforts of the Victorian letter carriers, let's now broaden our view to consider the profound impact of widespread letter writing on social connections. You might take instant communication for granted today, a quick video call, a fleeting text, a shared photo. But in the Victorian era, the humble letter was the bedrock of social interaction, shaping how families stayed connected, how friendships were maintained, and how communities, both local and across the vast British Empire, knitted themselves together. This pervasive culture of correspondence fundamentally reshaped personal relationships, fostering a unique blend of intimacy and distance. Imagine a family scattered across the country, or even across the globe. A daughter might have married and moved to a distant county. A son might have emigrated to Canada or Australia for new opportunities, or a brother might be serving in the military in India. Without the ability to travel frequently or the existence of telephones, letters became their lifeline. Weekly, sometimes even daily, exchanges of letters were not uncommon within close families. These weren't just brief updates. They were often lengthy chronicles of daily life, the state of the garden, the health of neighbors, the progress of children, the latest local gossip, even detailed accounts of the weather. This constant exchange fostered a deep, shared narrative. Despite physical separation, family members remained intimately aware of each other's lives, joys, and sorrows. The anticipation of a letter, the careful reading and rereading of its contents, and the thoughtful crafting of a reply all created a unique rhythm of connection. It was a slower, more deliberate form of intimacy, perhaps even more profound in its way than our fleeting digital interactions. The act of writing forced a certain reflection and articulation of thoughts and feelings that a quick chat might not. Historians still argue whether this reliance on written communication led to deeper emotional bonds, or simply a more formalized expression of them. Friendships, too, were nurtured through the written word. Close friends, separated by distance or circumstance, would maintain their bonds through regular correspondence, sharing secrets, offering advice, and providing emotional support. These letters often became repositories of shared jokes, inside references, and profound insights into each other's characters. It was a way of knowing someone's mind and heart, even if their physical presence was absent. The art of friendship, in many ways, became an epistolary art beyond personal relationships. Letter writing also profoundly impacted wider community and civic life. For the burgeoning middle-class, letters were essential for networking, establishing professional connections, and climbing the social ladder. Invitations, thank you notes, as we discussed, and letters of introduction were critical tools for navigating the complex social strata. Failure to correspond appropriately could mean social isolation or missed opportunities. This mainstream historical fact meant that epistolary skills were not just a personal asset, but a vital social and professional one. Consider the role of letters in the burgeoning Victorian intellectual and scientific communities. Scholars, scientists, and writers, often spread across different universities and institutions, used letters to share research, debate ideas, and collaborate on projects. Without the internet or academic conferences as we know them, the postal service was the primary engine of intellectual exchange. Groundbreaking discoveries were discussed, refined, and disseminated through handwritten missives, creating a vast, interconnected web of knowledge. The mass literacy campaigns of the Victorian era, partly spurred by the affordability of the penny post, further fueled this explosion in letter writing. As more people learned to read and write, the capacity for personal communication expanded dramatically, cutting across class boundaries. While the wealthiest might have employed secretaries for their correspondence, many ordinary working class individuals now had the means and the ability to correspond with loved ones who had migrated to industrial cities or foreign lands. This newfound ability to communicate provided a powerful sense of agency and connection for those who might otherwise have felt isolated. A quirky tidbit for you: the rise of letter-writing manuals and etiquette guides, offering advice on everything from how to propose marriage by letter to how to write a dignified condolence, speaks volumes about the importance placed on proper correspondence. These books were immensely popular, demonstrating a widespread desire to master this essential social skill. It shows how deeply ingrained letter writing was in the very fabric of Victorian social norms. Of course, this reliance on letters also brought its own set of anxieties. The waiting for a reply could be agonizing, especially if the news was anticipated to be significant. A delayed letter could cause immense worry, leading to sleepless nights and imagined calamities. The absence of a letter could be even worse, implying a slight, an illness, or simply that the correspondent had forgotten you. Unlike instant messaging, where you know if a message has been read, the Victorian letter often left the sender in a prolonged state of uncertainty. Despite these anxieties, the overall impact was overwhelmingly positive. Letter writing allowed for a depth of expression and reflection that modern, faster forms of communication often lack. The physical act of writing, the careful choice of words, the waiting for a reply, and the tangible nature of the letter itself, a piece of paper touched by the sender's hand, all contributed to a unique and powerful form of human connection. Letters became cherished keepsakes, tied with ribbon and saved in trunks, forming an invaluable archive of personal histories and societal trends. So, while our digital age has brought unparalleled speed and reach to communication, it's worth pausing to appreciate the profound social impact of the Victorian letter. It built bridges between distant relatives, solidified friendships, lubricated social interaction, and fueled intellectual exchange. It proves that even in a world devoid of instant gratification, human beings found powerful and meaningful ways to connect, one carefully penned word at a time. It reminds us that the medium truly can shape the message, and the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing created a unique tapestry of human connection. Having seen the profound way letter writing shaped Victorian social connections, we now arrive at a fascinating, perhaps even bittersweet, turning point: the decline of handwritten correspondence as the predominant form of communication. For decades, the handwritten letter reigned supreme, a king on the throne of communication. But like all monarchies, its reign was not eternal. As the Victorian era drew to a close and the new century dawned, technological innovations began to chip away at its dominance, slowly but inexorably ushering in an age of greater speed and immediacy. Imagine the turn of the 20th century. The grand, elaborate rituals of Victorian letter writing were still present, particularly in formal circles, but a subtle shift was underway. The relentless march of progress, the very same force that had given us the penny black, now began to offer alternatives that, while lacking the charm and tactile nature of a handwritten letter, offered something arguably more valuable to a rapidly industrializing society: speed. The first significant challenger to the handwritten letter's supremacy was the telegraph. Invented earlier in the Victorian era, its widespread adoption in the latter half of the century, particularly for business and urgent news, was a game-changer. Suddenly, a message could traverse vast distances in minutes, not days. While initially expansive and requiring a visit to a telegraph office, its utility for urgent communications, announcing births, deaths, critical business deals, or emergencies, was undeniable. You couldn't send a nuanced love letter via telegraph, but you could send an urgent summons or a vital piece of information. This introduced a new paradigm. Communication no longer needed to be asynchronous. This mainstream historical fact fundamentally altered expectations about the speed of information exchange. Then came the typewriter. While not replacing personal letters initially, the typewriter revolutionized business correspondence. Documents far more quickly than even the most skilled copyist. Businesses rapidly adopted typewriters, valuing efficiency over the personalized flourish of handwriting. This gradually led to a more impersonal, standardized style of business communication. A stark contrast to the often flowery and deferential tone of earlier commercial letters. The very look of a letter began to change, moving from artistic script to uniform typeface. The telephone, though still rudimentary in the late Victorian period and expensive to install. The concept of instantaneous, two-way vocal communication was revolutionary. No more waiting days for a reply. While early telephone networks were limited, their potential was clear. For personal calls, particularly within cities, it offered an immediacy that no letter could match. Of communication, or merely altered its form, it certainly changed the pace. Consider the cultural impact of this shift. As speed became a greater priority, the elaborate rituals of letter writing, the painstaking penmanship, the careful composition began to feel less necessary, even cumbersome. Why spend an hour crafting a perfect letter when a 5-minute phone call could convey the same information and more instantly? The social pressures to write beautifully and formally began to wane, particularly among younger generations who embraced the newer technologies. The proliferation of picture postcards was another factor. These small, pre-printed cards, often featuring scenic views or humorous illustrations, allowed for very brief messages to be written and sent cheaply. They were quicker to write than a full letter, and the visual element added a new dimension. While not a replacement for deep correspondence, they served as a popular method for quick greetings, holiday messages, or brief updates, especially for travelers. Visual-centric communication, the very concept of what constituted a letter, began to evolve. The long, multi-page epistles of the mid-Victorian era became less common, replaced by shorter, more direct notes. The art of cross-writing to save space, once a necessity, became obsolete with cheaper, universally available envelopes and flat-rate postage. The physical ritual of letter writing, once a daily practice for many, became a more occasional, perhaps nostalgic, activity. The decline was not abrupt. It was a gradual erosion. For some time, letters and new technologies coexisted, each serving different purposes. Urgent news went by telegraph or telephone, while more reflective or personal communications might still be sent by letter. But the trend was clear. The handwritten letter was slowly but surely being relegated from its position as the primary mode of social and business interaction. This transition also reflected broader societal changes. The pace of life accelerated. Cities grew larger, populations more mobile, and the demands of modern commerce intensified. Efficiency and speed became increasingly valued, sometimes at the expense of the more reflective, slower rhythms that suited traditional letter writing. The personal connection, once nurtured over weeks of correspondence, now sought more immediate gratification. The legacy of this decline is evident in our own time. We live in an age of unparalleled instant communication, where physical letters are now largely reserved for formal documents, bills, or sentimental occasions. Our now niche interests, the quiet ritual of sitting down with pen and paper, the smell of ink, the careful pressing of a seal. These sensory experiences have largely vanished from daily life. So, as the Victorian era faded into history, so too did the unchallenged reign of the handwritten letter. It wasn't a sudden fall, but a slow, graceful descent. As new technologies offered faster, though arguably less intimate, ways to connect. It makes you wonder what forms of communication we take for granted today will be considered quaint and cumbersome by future generations. The peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing remind us that even the most enduring forms of human connection are subject to the relentless currents of innovation and change. As the sun sets on the age of handwritten supremacy, casting long shadows over forgotten inkwells and dusty sealing wax, we arrive at our final reflection, the legacy of Victorian letter writing and its surprising echoes in modern communication. You might think that the meticulous habits of our Victorian ancestors, with their specific paper, their formal closings, and their elaborate seals, are utterly divorced from our world of instant messages, emojis, and video calls. But peer a little closer, and you'll discover that many of the underlying principles, the unspoken rules, and even some of the anxieties they faced, have subtly shaped the way we connect today. Consider the concept of privacy and security. Victorians, obsessed over the integrity of their wax seals and the discreet nature of their messages. They feared prying eyes, whether from a nosy postman rare, but a concern, a curious servant, or a suspicious relative. Fast forward to today, we, too, grapple with privacy. We fret over data breaches, encrypted messages, and the security of our online communications. The desire to keep our personal thoughts confidential, to ensure our messages reach only the intended recipient without alteration, is a direct echo of the Victorian concern over a broken seal or an intercepted letter. While the technology has changed from wax to algorithms, the fundamental human need for secure, private communication remains. Historians still argue whether the perceived privacy of Victorian letters was a genuine reality or largely a carefully maintained illusion. Then there's the art of etiquette and social signaling. Remember the labyrinthine rules of Victorian salutations, closings, and appropriate tones for different relationships. You wouldn't address your spouse with your obedient servant, just as you wouldn't sign a formal business letter, yours affectionately. These distinctions, though less rigid now, are very much alive in our digital interactions. We use different tones for emails to our boss versus texts to our friends. We know that a casual hey is fine for a peer, but a more formal dear name is expected for a professional contact. We instinctively understand that a lengthy email requires a different opening and closing than a quick shorthand text. We even have read receipts on messages, a digital echo of the Victorian anxiety over whether their letter had been received and read. This mainstream historical fact shows that even without formal manuals, we still navigate complex social codes. In our everyday digital exchanges, the brevity versus depth debate is another fascinating parallel. Victorians, limited by postage costs and writing effort, often tried to pack as much information as possible into a single sheet, sometimes resorting to the bizarre practice of crossing their letters. Yet, they also embraced the lengthy, reflective epistle for deeper connections. Today, we face a similar tension. We have the option of sending a lightning-fast, abbreviated text message, the digital equivalent of a postcard, or a brief, functional note. Or we can compose a long, detailed email, or even a blog post for more in-depth communication. The choice of medium often dictates the depth and complexity of the message, just as it did for the Victorians. Consider the impact of speed. The penny post revolutionized communication by making it faster and more affordable, compressing days of travel into hours. Yet the Victorians still endured periods of anxious waiting. Now, our expectation of instantaneous replies has created its own pressures. The ping of an incoming message, the expectation of an immediate response, can lead to digital fatigue and an impatience that our ancestors, accustomed to weeks of waiting, could barely conceive. This intense pressure for immediacy, in some ways, is a direct, if exaggerated, legacy of the initial drive for faster communication that began in the Victorian era. Even the visual aspects of communication have echoes. While we don't use mourning, stationery with black borders, we do use emojis and memes to convey emotional nuance and tone that might otherwise be lost in text-only communication. A crying face emoji can convey sadness far more quickly than a written sentence, much like a specific flower or a stamp placement might have done for a Victorian. The desire for a rich, multi-layered message that goes beyond mere words is a timeless, human impulse. A quirky tidbit, the increasing use of stylized fonts, colored backgrounds, and animated GIFs in our digital messages can be seen as a modern equivalent of the elaborate penmanship, embossed paper, and sealing wax that Victorians used to personalize and embellish their correspondence, that the very act of collecting and archiving letters has found a digital equivalent. While Victorians tied up their treasured letters with ribbons and stored them in boxes, we save our important emails, archive our chat histories, and scroll back through old conversations. Our digital communications form a personal historical record, much like the physical letters did for past generations. We cherish these digital memories just as they cherished their physical ones, in essence. The peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing weren't just quaint historical curiosities. They laid the groundwork for many of the communication challenges, innovations, and social expectations we navigate today. The penny black was the original democratizer of communication, making it accessible to the masses, much like the internet did centuries later. The desire for connection, the need for both formality and intimacy, the struggle for privacy, and the constant push for greater efficiency are threads that run continuously from the Victorian age to our own dot. So, as you drift off, perhaps thinking about the rhythmic scratch of a quill pen or the satisfying snap of a wax seal, remember that the seemingly distant world of Victorian letter writing isn't so distant after all. Its legacy lives on, woven into the very fabric of our modern digital lives. It reminds us that while the tools may change, the fundamental human need to connect, to share, to express, and to be understood remains eternally the same. Sweet dreams.